Today we're going to hear presentations from 5 individuals. There are biographies in the program for each speaker. We're going to follow the order as listed in the program. So we'll begin with Jason Graham from the Federal Reserve of New York, followed by Heidi Schwartz from the Economic Policy Institute. Then yours truly will speak, followed by Robert Ward at the Rockefeller Institute, and then finally Jacob Klerman at APP. Each speaker will be given 10 minutes to present on their respective topics, and then we will open the floor to a discussion from the audience, and hopefully we'll have a very productive and fruitful conversation. So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to Jason Graham.
Thank you very much. So I'll try to speed through this, make that a couple minutes maybe. First, let me start out saying the views and whatever I say here are mine and not those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System, especially if I say something stupid. I was asked to bring to use 2 or maybe 3 slides. So I brought 10, which reminds me that I've heard basically there are 3 kinds of economists: the kind that can count and the kind that can't. So on that note, let me start off just to give you. What my purpose is to just give you a very quick overview of the macro picture of the U.S. economy, and I'm going to try to give you some charts that are a little bit different than what you might have seen in the past. I mean, everyone knows this is, I don't know if it's the worst recession since the early 80s or the mid-70s or the 30s, but it's certainly the worst recession in a long time. And I think in many ways it is the worst recession since probably the 30s. Now, the recession, of course, started in the housing sector. It then moved to the financial sector last year, pretty much. And that was when things really deteriorated. Moved to the financial sector, then very quickly to what we call the household sector, the consumer sector. And that's right now what I think is being grappled with. A lot of the financial issues, a lot of the sort of clogging in the financial system, has, I don't know if it's totally resolved, but it's certainly been improved upon, has been addressed. So, first what's going on is basically there's an issue of inflation and deflation. And the sort of volatile line you see there, I think is kind of red, is just basically the year-over-year % change in the consumer price index. And so you have this run-up in oil prices last year and in 2007, and then oil prices collapsed, and now they've come up a little. But basically overall inflation got up to close to 5%. The reason that the Fed and other people look at what's called the core CPI, is the sort of excluding food and energy, is that when the two diverge, they tend to converge back to where the core is. In other words, it's more likely that the CPI will drift back toward the core rate than vice versa. Right now, of course, one of the big debates and one of the big concerns is that you have a lot of people that are concerned about deflation. We have asset price deflation, which I'll get into in a sec. And a lot of people are concerned that with all the stimulus out there, with the increase in money supply and so forth, some people are concerned mostly longer term about inflation. So you have this very, it depends who you talk to. There's some people who are really concerned about deflation, some people who are really concerned about inflation. But what's interesting is that inflation expectations have actually been pretty stable. People expect inflation to remain about 3%. And there's a lot of sort of inertia in inflation. So we can quickly go to the next one. Basically, the red line here is real personal consumption expenditures. What happened in this recession basically is what's been different is that you have severe asset price deflation. So things like people's debt asset ratios, companies' debt asset ratios, because asset values have gone down, these ratios have gone up. So it's not that suddenly people have taken on more debt suddenly, it's that the levels of debt that people had became less sustainable because of the asset prices going down. The same thing with debt income ratios. And so you can see that what's happened is disposable income growth has kind of slowed to almost nothing. But what's really interesting is personal consumption expenditures is very unusual to see an outright decline in actual consumer spending during a recession. Usually what happens is the more cyclical sectors have big declines and consumer spending growth slows. But to actually see a decline like this for so long is very unusual. And what's going on is that people are saving more. The personal saving rate, which had been very low for a very long time, and a lot of people were probably rightfully concerned about that, has now surged because people are trying to make up, when your savings goes down, because asset prices go down, then you have to kind of compensate, save more. People are also more skittish about, having money in reserve, about spending all their money. So this is something that is causing the consumer spending and the economy to really weaken dramatically. Next slide. And this is reflected consumer confidence indexes. I like to focus on the conference board one, which is the blue line. I know it's kind of hard to read all these. But basically, consumer confidence by any measure has been and continues to be at or near record lows. So, whether it got down, was a little bit lower at some point in the 70s. The point is confidence is at an exceptionally low level. And even though it's come up a little bit, it's still at levels that are, for example, lower than at any point in the last recession. And lower than even by some measures, lower than in the 1982 recession, which was a very severe recession. And I'll get into the breadth of it in a minute. Next slide. Now, really what's going on, and this is what's going on with consumer confidence, is not just that the job market is weak, and I'll have an unemployment chart in a sec, but it's really the speed and severity with which the job situation has deteriorated. So, you haven't seen anything like this. You've seen, ongoing job losses during, say, the early 80s. You saw in the last recession, even you sort of had this jobless recovery. But you've really never seen anything that steep. A year ago, things really weren't that bad. A year ago, this is what, July? Last July, there was still debate whether we were even in a recession. Some people thought the economy was fundamentally sound, whatever. So, if you go to the next chart, you can see the same thing in the unemployment rate. The steepness with which it's gone up. So unemployment is still not where it was in the early 80s, but the steepness with which it's gone up, about 4 percentage points in just the last year, is basically, again, unprecedented. And this kind of has driven a lot of the weakness. It sort of feeds off itself. You have a weak housing market, you have the job market deteriorating, which then, at first it was banks, had issues. 5 minutes, great. At first it was that banks were not lending for various reasons because the financial system was hot. But once you get into a situation like that, what's happening is banks are reluctant to lend because, frankly, it's very risky that any given person is going to have their job a year from now. A lot of people who have their jobs, they've lost wages, they've lost a wage earner. People whose income fluctuates, real estate agents, so forth, they're being very affected by this. Next. Okay, this is the Philadelphia Fed does a state coincidence index for each of the states. It's supposed to be basically a measure, an overall measure of how the economy is doing geographically. Now, I should say, I'm talking about the macroeconomy. I'm really secondly a macroeconomist and first a regional economist. So I like to look at these kind of things as sort of distribution. And basically what you can see is the red and blue are not like what you think of as red and blue states. These are just, it happens. The red states are the ones doing badly, and the blue states are the ones doing well. Now, this doesn't look so bad. This is February to May 2008. So the red states are the ones that over that 3-month period declined, the blue states increased. Now, if you go to the next one, you'll see February to May 2009, which is how it is now. Now, why North Dakota is, you get regional data, it's kind of quirky. I don't think North Dakota is really doing that well. But, I think if you did, I wanted to have it up to date. The January to April one is all red, different shades of red, mostly dark red. But this is what I think makes this recession different than a lot of others since at least the 70s. Because in each of the last few recessions, the last 2 recessions were actually not all that severe. The last 2 recessions were not all that severe at the national level, just in terms of GDP, unemployment, unemployment and so forth. You had the 2001 recession, the 1990 recession. The 1990 recession was very steep in this region, but not nationally. You have to go back to 82 to have a really bad recession when unemployment got to 10%. But even then, it was concentrated in certain parts of the country, in the Midwest. New York City actually did pretty well. A lot of the country did okay. The financial sector did okay. So you really have to go back to the mid-70s, I think, to find a recession that really hit the whole country, that hit a lot of different sectors. But even that recession was not, by any measure as steep as the current recession. So I think it's important to keep in mind that it's really the breadth and depth, both, of this recession that makes it scary in a way and unique. Next chart. And this, if you want to look through your state here, this is basically the vertical axis. The vertical axis is what home prices were doing in the middle of the decade, and the horizontal dimension is what they've done pretty much in the past year. And you can see that the areas that had the biggest price appreciation, and I'm sure a lot of you know this, California, Nevada, Florida, Arizona, even Maryland, DC, Hawaii, and so forth, have had some of the biggest price increases, are now the ones generally seeing the steepest declines. At the other end, you have places like Oklahoma, Indiana, and so forth, where you didn't see the same kind of run-up, but you're not seeing the same kind of weakness. And even in New York State, there are parts of New York State that, basically in the last decade didn't really have that good an expansion, Buffalo, Rochester, upstate New York. But then again, these are not areas seeing big declines in home prices. So, in a sense, things are getting back to equilibrium. But what started out as a big, severe recession in these kind of big house price states is now spread to the rest of the nation. So even though some states have been hit harder than others, this doesn't capture the weakness of the economy. Stop. Okay, next.
So the whole in right now is 8.8 million jobs. We are in an enormous trough. Okay, next slide. This shows unemployment from sort of an interesting perspective. This shows the number of unemployed workers per job opening. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't just count jobs, they also count job openings. Since the start of the recession, job openings have declined by 42%. At the same time, there's been an additional 7.2 million people thrown out of work. So that ratio of the number of job seekers per job opening has just been skyrocketing. At the start of the recession, there were less than 2 job seekers for every available job. That last, by the way, in all of my plots, the shaded bars mean recession. So you can see the recession of the early 2000s and the current recession. This is as far back as these data go. But right now, the latest data available for job openings is May. Nearly 6 unemployed workers for every job opening, which really underscores what we're seeing now with record numbers of unemployed people getting stuck in unemployment for long periods. They're just, the chances of finding a job once you become unemployed are very thin in the state of mind. Okay, next one. An important point in all of this is that since last fall, basically the entire economic profession has completely missed the deterioration that we have seen. And this is the chart that makes me sort of embarrassed to be honest. This shows so what this chart shows is just how dramatic that underestimation has been. These show blue chip forecasts, where blue chip forecasts is just an aggregate of dozens of professional economic forecasts. So this shows those forecasters through the end of this year over time. Look, the bottom line, those are the forecasts, the blue chip forecasts that were made last October. Last October, they were estimating that unemployment would peak at 7% now, and that would be the end of it. We passed 7% last December. So this is where everyone thought we were, and you can just see, it's just with every month, people are saying, oh no, it's a lot worse than we ever expected. This just had the administration underestimated, the Fed underestimated, everyone missed this. So one of the important points I think that's behind this is that the stimulus package that we have has been basically eaten already by the unexpected deterioration in the economy. When the stimulus package was passed, wait, let me back for a second. The stimulus will do what it said it was going to do. It will create between 3 and 4 million jobs. The problem is, in March, the stimulus package was passed in February. In March, before virtually $1 of that had been spent, we were 7 million jobs in the hole. So before that thing got out of the gates, the hole was twice as big as it was ever expected to fill in. It was simply never big enough to solve this. In other words, before, economists thought that the stimulus package will keep us at around 8% instead of their worst-case scenario without stimulus, which might have been around 10%. Now the baseline is totally different. It's ratcheted up. Now the stimulus will hopefully keep us around 10% instead of 12.5%. So that it's just the baseline has just been shifting through the last, since last fall. Okay, next slide. All right, so now we know things have deteriorated more than anyone ever expected. So I'm going to give you some forecasts, which feel free to ignore. So this is non-sophisticated forecast. This is actually just a little exercise. So I'm not doing any art here. This just shows, so the end of that recession is, what if the recession ended in June? I don't think that happened, but let's assume the recession ended in June, GDP started growing, industrial production is up, the recession is over. Those 3 lines that branch off, we're going to get that. I think the belief is that we will get a recovery that looks more like either after the 90s or the 2001 recovery, which is what those top lines show. In both of those recessions, unemployment continued to increase for a year and a half after the end of the official recession. If we follow a scenario like that, unemployment will be higher than 10% for all of 2010. It will be near 10% for all of 2011. And in 2014, 5 years from now, unemployment will still be around 8%. So the bottom line here is that we are looking at a very long haul for the working families of this country. Okay, last slide. This just takes, what this does is it takes academic estimates of what is the effect of increasing unemployment on poverty and just predicts what will the poverty rate be with unemployment of 10%, which we will reach by the fall. So with unemployment of 10%, poverty will go from its 2007 rate of 12.5%, that's the official poverty rate in 2007, to 14.8%. But we know many groups are hit harder than others. Some groups are much more vulnerable than others. Kids particularly vulnerable. Kids' unemployment rate, kids' poverty rate at an unemployment rate of 10% will be up over 1/4. 1/4 of all kids living in poverty. If you look at black kids, the situation is much more dire. In 2007, there were already over 1/3 of black kids living in poverty, which is a nightmare unto itself. This recession will make it so more than half of black kids are living in poverty. About 1/3 of blacks as a whole will be living in poverty, and nearly half of single mothers will be living in poverty. So the bottom line is this thing is going to have long-lasting effects on the living standards of millions of families. And just to quickly wrap up, I don't have, So I don't have good policy prescriptions here, but one thing that we know is that the economic case for substantial additional stimulus spending is clear. We know that the other stimulus package, the February stimulus package was completely eaten by this unexpected deterioration in the economy. We know that we have to do more spending to do two things: provide relief to the people hardest hit by this thing, and two, get the economy back on track. Get the economy back on track, so we can start creating jobs so people can get the jobs and hours that they need to provide for their families. All right.
Thanks. Since I have a self-control problem, I'll actually ask Jason to do the timing for me. The last slide is a nice segue to what I'm going to talk about, which is the current economy and the social safety net. Historically, the poverty rate, as well as various indicators of deep poverty, have been countercyclical, which means that they increase during recessions and decrease during expansions. So, for example, the poverty rate, which in this case just measures the fraction of persons living in poverty, rose about 17% during the recessionary period of, that's not percentage points, that's percent. During the recessionary period of 80 to 83, it rose about 12% between 90 and 93, and about 11% between 2000 and 2003. Deep poverty, as measured by the fraction of people living below 1/2 of the poverty line, rose even more dramatically in each of these three periods. It was 34% from 1980 to 83, 20% from 90 to 93, and 18% from 2000 to 2003. The trend across all three of these previous recessions has been a decline in the percentage increase in poverty. This might be considered good news. However, as both Jason and Heidi have made eminently clear, The current recession has a lot more in common with the 1980 to 83 period, and perhaps is even worse. And thus, we should expect poverty to increase at a more rapid pace than in the past two recessions. Usually, it's just clearly individuals in this room, and maybe only a very small subset of individuals in this room that pay attention to Poverty Day, which is the day that the Census Bureau releases their statistics. And so I suspect this year, David Johnson and his colleagues at the Census Bureau will be a very popular person at the end of August when they announce the 2008 poverty statistics. Now, mitigating the increase in poverty is our system of automatic stabilizers within the social safety net. By construction, expenditures on these automatic stabilizers are also supposed to be counter-cyclical. And the basic idea is that they're designed to insure against idiosyncratic risk, and in some cases against systemic risk. For low-income families, the primary automatic stabilizers are the unemployment insurance system, the food stamp program, or SNAP, as it's known today, and the system of federal and state income taxes, including the earned income tax credit. The former AFTC program was also considered an automatic stabilizer, but its replacement, TANF, technically is not, because it's not an entitlement program, and therefore does not automatically expand and contract the business cycle. However, of course, we can have acts of Congress, such as earlier this spring, that can expand eligibility and generosity. Likewise, the WIC program, Section 8 housing, LIHEAP, SSI, DI, and Medicaid are not automatic stabilizers because of the lack of entitlement status and or extra eligibility conditions, such as disability in the case of SSI and DI. So this really leaves three main safety net programs that automatically respond to families, assist families during recessionary periods: the Unemployment Insurance Program, SNAP, and the EITC, and taxes more generally. Now we know that UI replaces a portion of lost wages, SNAP provides food assistance, and the EITC provides a tax credit for low-income workers. But UI has its own shortcomings as a stabilizer, namely, receipt is limited to 26 weeks, unless again we have an act of Congress extending eligibility, and there are restrictions on eligibility depending on the type of work and the length of time that you've been in the labor force. Now also, ironically, the other two programs, SNAP and the EITC, do not show up in our official poverty statistics, and thus it's less straightforward to track their anti-poverty effectiveness across the business cycle. Now many of you may not think of the federal income tax as an automatic stabilizer. Here's the basic idea how this works. As your taxable income increases, the marginal tax rate in our federal system, as well as in many state systems, increases at pre-specified intervals. Thus, if your labor market earnings fall during a recession, your marginal tax rate has a tendency to fall, your taxable income falls, and therefore, with the reduction in taxable income, as well as the marginal tax rate, your tax liability falls. So in fact, the system is an automatic stabilizer because your after-tax income falls by less than your before-tax income. And work with Tom Kniesner at Syracuse University, we showed that the series of tax reforms over the 1980s and 1990s reduced the effectiveness of the tax system as an automatic stabilizer by about 1/2. Now there were some efficiency gains during that period by reducing marginal tax rates, but the implicit insurance offered by the tax code was cut in half, except for low-income families, because of the increased generosity of the earned income tax credit. Now, it is the case, of course, that the EITC provides no assistance to families without labor market earnings during the calendar year, nor does it provide any assistance for those with earnings above the eligibility threshold. In a 2006 paper, I calculated how much additional poverty reduction the food stamp program at the EITC offers over and above government transfers included in the official poverty statistics. As my indicator of poverty, I use what's known as the poverty gap, which measures the amount of money needed to lift all persons to the poverty line. In the last recession, I found that income transfers used in the official poverty rate reduced pre-tax and pre-transfer poverty gap by about 61%. And including food stamps and EITC, reduced the poverty gap an additional 3 percentage points to about 64% from the pre-tax and pre-transfer levels. So although the automatic stabilizers of food stamps and EITC do assist low-income families during recessionary periods, there are concerns about the adequacy of the safety net going forward. First of all, the safety net today fills much less of the poverty gap than it did 2 decades ago. 2 decades ago, about 70% of the gap was filled, but that fell to the low 60s by the early 2000s. Among single mother families, who of course were the lens of the welfare reforms of the 1980s, the fraction of the poverty gap that was filled plunged from 70% in 1980 to about 51% in 2001 because of the massive drop in the AFPC food stamp program participation. Second, the average per person poverty gap increased by about 50% from 1980 to 2003, inclusive of food stamps and the EITC. This, of course, is in real terms. By 2003, the average poor person would need an additional $2,900 per year to live under the poverty line. So again, that's about a 50% increase from what it was 2 decades ago. Even counting cash and in-kind transfers, except for the Medicaid program. These trends do not bode well for low-income families in the current recession. And therefore, I believe, and I think there are many people in this room believe, that there's broad scope for reforms to the safety net to improve its anti-poverty effectiveness, and in particular to improve the effectiveness of the system as an insurance program against both idiosyncratic and systemic risk. Thank you very much. I lead by example, finish early.
Good morning. Well, our previous speakers on this panel have set a high bar for staying on time, a rare event for a conference in my experience. I don't know about you. But I will do my best to meet their high standards. I am going to talk about the fiscal environment for states as well as their extended localities, focusing primarily on states. Recent past, the present, looking forward to the future. I'm not using a PowerPoint. There are some handouts on your table with several graphs that are relevant. If you don't have enough at the table, maybe folks can share. I'm going to start out with looking at the recent past. And many people here are aware that the Roundtable Institute for a long time now has tracked state tax revenues every quarter. And the data that I'm going to go over are all from reports that are available on our website if you're looking for more information on these things. But if you go back over the last, say, half dozen years, much of that period was a pretty good time for state budgets. And particularly shown on this first graph in front of you are the combined state and local tax revenues, quarterly changes in those. This particular graph smooths them a little bit by using a 4-quarter average. And these are inflation-adjusted terms. And I'll return to that in a few moments because I want to say something about inflation adjustments. But if you go back again to 2004 up to even into fiscal 2007, times were not bad. They were actually pretty good. The income tax in particular, a very important revenue source for states, typically 30 to 35% on average of state tax revenues. The income tax on a quarterly basis was growing at a rate of anywhere from 6 to 9%. That's pretty good, again, especially after you account for inflation. Sales tax, roughly an equivalently important source of revenue for states overall. Not as sharp a rate of growth, but still pretty healthy, 3 to 6% during that period. And then as the economy started to slow down, we saw, of course, the revenues also start to slow down. And particularly in the last couple of quarters, really a plunge in the collections from both income tax and sales tax. Again, the two major sources of revenue for states. And so this is, of course, the main reason that states all across the country are facing the budgetary problems that they are, in addition to what's going on the expenditure side of the budget. So, getting back to the inflation adjustment, which I just want to touch on briefly because it's important to understand, I think, and a case in point, a cautionary case in point, was yesterday's article in the New York Times about Michigan. which some folks may have seen, pointing out that after years and years of cuts and cuts, the state has not managed to balance its budget. And there was a chart that was given to the Times by the Michigan Department of Revenue. And anybody hear from the state of Michigan by any chance? Okay. Folks from Michigan may have more insights on this, but speaking strictly of the revenue picture, the data showed inflation-adjusted revenue collections using the GDP deflator for state and local government expenditures. And one thing that we've pointed out in our Rockefeller Institute reports over the last year or so is that the deflator for state and local government expenditures has spiked sharply higher than other measures of inflation. And as a result, if you adjust downward using that measure, you're really, at least arguably, giving a misleading picture, a negatively misleading picture of the revenues. That sort of measure is probably appropriate on the expenditure side in many instances, but not necessarily on the revenue side. So this chart here uses a different price deflator, the overall price deflator for the overall economy. And again, a sidetrack, but I know there are many people in the room who probably do these sorts of statistical analyses over time using governmental budget figures, and it's a syndrome in the BEA measurements that we don't fully understand, but we think is worth keeping an eye on. So again, the immediate picture for both sales and income taxes is very bad right now. In fact, later this week we expect to be issuing our latest quarterly report on state and local revenues, and we'll point out in that report that the first quarter of 2009, the decline on a year-over-year basis from the same quarter in 2008 shows the sharpest decline since at least World War II. So this is I think the real clear indication as to, again, why so many states are facing the very dramatic budgetary problems that they are. Now again, it's worth keeping in mind that that's a decline from a level that, at least going back a couple of years, was pretty good. So that, I think, suggests two things about how states need to manage their resources. Obviously, we need to figure out how to deal with declines, such as those in the present time, but perhaps we also need to think about managing the good times a little more carefully. Moving to the second slide, not a slide, not two slides, second graph in front of you. This shows the near-term future. And several months ago in February, my colleague Don Boyd did a very good report asking the question, what happens when the money runs out? Referring to the federal stimulus aid that has been so important to states this year and even at the end of the previous fiscal year and for the fiscal year that starts in 2010. At the time that Don did the report, it looked as though Congress was going to enact the stimulus, but he included a line in there just for illustration to show what would happen without the stimulus. And the green line shows what would be the picture for states with the stimulus in place. And the balance or budget gap as a percentage of general expenditures in the current fiscal year 2010, somewhere between 2 and 4% of expenditures. Once the money runs out, the picture gets dramatically worse, with that gap going to something in the range of 7 to 8%. So this is something that many people are aware of, i.e. referring to the need for additional stimulus. Certainly, if there is not additional stimulus, states will be in very precarious positions. I guess the question is, what happens if there is additional stimulus? Will it be permanent, or will we again be asking what happens when the money runs out? But the basic conclusion there is that based on what we can see in the economy now, tax revenues are not going to grow at all in the coming year. We expect continuing decline in the second quarter of 2009 and very possibly in the third quarter. So it is a very challenging picture. Quickly moving to the third page of the handout, a much longer-term picture presented by the Government Accountability Office in several reports that they have done over the last couple of years. If you think times are tough right now, just wait and see what the next decade or two brings. And GAO looked at the overall, they made projections of overall expenditures for states, put those up against expected revenues, and what they show essentially is a very steady downhill trend for states in terms of overall fiscal balance, driven primarily by Medicaid and by health care and other benefit costs for public employees. Now, they don't even take into account here, for instance, the unfunded pension issue for public employees, but it's a very, I think, troubling picture, a very sobering picture, and the question arises, what will happen, recognizing that expenditures continue to go up well above the inflation rate, revenues, once we come out of the current recession, presumably we will see some recovery in revenues, but again, at least based on the projections, not enough to offset the rising level of expenditures. Those are the questions on the table, and I am fortunate that I don't have to answer them because I run out of time.
Good morning. I was asked to speak about recession and the demand for assistance. And as I look around the room, some things I think that's very good. So I can speak a little about demand, but the previous comments in particular remind me that states face a very challenging environment, and I think that the supply of assistance, the policies that states offer, the people and therefore sign up for, are changing rapidly and are likely to continue changing rapidly over the next couple of years. And that means that what I'm going to say about demand, as we say in economics, means supply, and may go in different places than I'm about to say. So I mean, that's my introduction. I wanted to speak here briefly. I want to say three things, since I think here people have good questions that perhaps better than our comments. I guess the first thing I want to say pretty much follows up on what Dr. Ward said, which is that everybody in this room knows that things in terms of state budgets in general and demand for social welfare programs in particular is bad. And I guess that my message here is that things bad now, it's going to get worse, and it's going to get much worse, and it's going to get much worse for a long time. And I want to explain why I believe that's true, based on my research and other people's research, and perhaps it'll help some of you to think about planning overall. So what I basically do is that clean up and draw on the pieces that have been given by the various speakers. So the first thing we've heard is that everyone in this room is aware that we're in a deep recession. And at least the columnists that I read, protect the Wall Street Journal, like to talk about the recessions in terms of letters. It seems unlikely that this recession is going to be a V, a steep decline followed by a steep increase. Some people are talking about U's, a steep decline followed by a trough and then increase later. Some people are talking about W's that will maybe go back into recession after that. And some people are talking about L's that will essentially not recover for a long time, perhaps like you might have thought about the Great Depression. And I'm not the macroeconomist in this room, but my sense from reading the Wall Street Journal and watching the financial markets is that we may be at the trough already, but it's far from clear that that's true. In fact, the experiences in the weeks since I received this indication has made me slightly more pessimistic. And so I think the first thing to say is that the changes in the real economy, we are perhaps at the trough, and perhaps the trough is several months, maybe several quarters away. So that's the first piece. The second piece is the piece that I believe that Heidi said, which is the labor market in general lags the real economy. I think the number you gave was 2 years. And so that means that in terms of our caseloads of people looking for work that would get them off of welfare or welfare SSI or a TANF or a food stamps account called SNAP, that's not going to happen for the most part until the labor market recovers, which is 7 years after the real economy recovers. And then the next point after that, which is perhaps my contribution to this discussion, is that in a group of work that I did in the early 2000s with steep hiring we showed that the caseloads, both food stamps, now called SNAP, and AFPC, now called TANF, react with a lag to the changes in the unemployment rate. So even if the labor market recovers in 2 years, the recovery for caseloads are likely to be a year, 2 years after that. Now, the figure that's up over here is from joint work with Carolyn Danielson. This is a SNAP caseload. For a variety of reasons, it's a more useful way to think about total assistance caseloads than looking at AFPC TANF. And the main thing I want to point out here is that there are 2 lines in the early 1990s before the major changes that occurred in welfare with Peror and the things that Paul said. And the crucial thing to note here is that this has the fact that the turning point in the unemployment rate occurred about 2 years before the turning rate in the caseload. If that's what's true in this graph, if you look at AFPC TANF, it's also true later. And if you look at more formal econometric methods, the same thing turns out. There's a strong dependence on the unemployment rate a year ago, 2 years ago, even 3 years and 4 years ago. So it's going to take 4, 5, 6 years until the stuff that's happening now works its way through the system of the economy, in the labor market, and then works its way out of the program caseloads. That's a terrifying thought for you, I'm sure, as administrators. It's a terrifying thought for me when I think about our fellow citizens, the people who are in that situation. I think it's something we all need to understand. That's what will happen in terms of demand. And of course, we've heard that the states are in significant financial crisis, and it would not surprise me if we see significant changes in terms of supply, states changing the terms under which they offer programs. It appears the federal government has made SNAP slightly more generous, but states, in some cases, are moving in the opposite direction. So we may see these demand moving one way and supply may counterbalance that. But in terms of what people are going to ask from us, I think that things are going to get worse, continue getting worse for many, many years before they start to turn back up. Now, a little bit of modesty is appropriate. At the beginning of Peror, I remember sitting in the room at the ACF research conference and arguing about exactly how strong the relationship was. At that time, based on some work that Steve Hyder and I did, I argued relatively strong. In fact, the relation of the welfare caseload, the AFPC TANF, is relatively mild. And that's, in fact, my second slide. So, what I want to say about this is that it's, in fact, difficult to extrapolate caseload expectation of what will happen in the economy from recent experience. And the reason for that is that we don't have a pure experiment in terms of what's happening in either of the major assistance programs, AFPC TANF or SNAP. The 2 programs have changed in diametrically different ways over the period that we've seen here, as I'm sure that everybody in this room is aware. I want to talk briefly about those 2 sets of changes and their implications and what's going to happen here in terms of demand program. So what's happened in AFPC TANF is both in terms of black letter law and regulation, and also in terms of, as I understand it, the soft field of program when you walk into a welfare office, is that the program has gone from being vaguely neutral about encouraging or discouraging people from signing up to being a very negative program. We discourage people from coming on, we often push them from going off in a variety of official and unofficial ways. And that has caused the sharp decline in the caseload of what you see in the purple at the bottom. But as everybody in this room knows, the AFPC TANF caseload has dropped like a stone. In fact, in many states today, the AFPC TANF caseload essentially has none of what we used to think of as single mothers. It's all child-only cases, what you might call extreme hardship, people that are waiting to apply for SSI and other special cases like that. And as we think about the demand for the program, that is AFPC TANF, the real question is whether or not in those states the program it's possible that it will go back to being a social safety net program. And my preliminary read to the answer to that question is no. That in many states that program is essentially gone. The rules are in place, the whole fielding is in place, that won't happen again. That could be wrong. In some states the program does look like the public roles program, has a large number of single mothers, AFPC, what it calls UPs, 2-parent families, and those states would expect the cases to go back up perhaps, not to those like before, but at least farther up like the still happen. The situation on what used to call the food stamp program, now called SNAP, the simple SNAP, now blanking with the title, is exactly the opposite. It went from basically a neutral, black letter law and regulation software program to a program which at this point is very open. The regulations have changed, making it easier to sign up, easier to stay signed up, not only for welfare recipients, but also for working people. And in addition, there's been expansions in the field and in the benefits themselves. And what you can see here, the green line is people who are on SNAP that were not on cash assistance, and that has gone up well above the overall caseload, well above what you would have expected for the economy, based on the economy. And there's every indication that will continue to occur over the recession that we're in, and therefore we expect that program to explode. But it's important to remember that the size of the benefits of that program are considerably smaller than the size of the benefits that we're used to seeing in the FTC Canada, and therefore it's a smaller stimulus. It's a smaller stabilizer. And the last one I want to make, and I'm just about out of time, is that I think it's important to keep an eye on fertility. I don't have firm research evidence to follow the statement, but it is true that there was a sharp decline in fertility, especially in welfare-eligible populations, young women, especially minority women over this period. Very large decline, especially teenagers. And at least some of the decline that we observed in the Canada caseload was due to the fact that there are simply fewer women who were eligible because they had young children. There's recent work by myself and another one I co-authored, Jeremy Arcus, that suggests that the conventional pattern, which was that the economy, that the fertility moves procyclically, may have turned around. There's some evidence that that decline may be due to the improving economy. And therefore, there's a concern that as the economy gets worse, those patterns will reverse. There's at least some vague evidence of that in recent NCHS data on fertility. And if that occurs, then we may see another reason why there'll be a long-term effect of this recession on demand for transfer programs, because there'll be more children, single mothers might therefore benefit from exactly those types of programs in the past. Those fertility trends will push the caseload down, and it's at least possible fertility trends will push the caseload back up. And for that, we'll begin to get a signal on that this summer, this fall, when the new fertility numbers come out, and more into the situation evolves. Thank you.
Figured out your break has been largely sabotaged here. We're going to allocate about 15 minutes, lead us up to about 11 o'clock before we convene this session or begin the next current sessions. So what I'm going to do is open the floor. I ask that you raise your hand and preferably stand up and state your name. I actually see microphones here, so maybe that's ideal if you walk up to the mic to ask your question, and please direct it to the individual you'd like to address, or to the panel as a whole.
This is Albany from NYU. I'm directing this particularly to high styles for the panel in general, and that is that I don't have this except to say your predictions of hardship. All I can say is I don't believe it. There's something that doesn't ring true about what you're saying, and it isn't that the numbers are wrong. It's that the sense of hardship and crisis and pain and suffering that has occurred in previous recessions. I don't now hear this outside. Based on what I read in the press and the news accounts, the alarmism is coming from the economists. It's not coming from the people. I don't know how to put it more strongly than that. In the early 80s, which is the nearest parallel, there was pain and suffering. There was a sense of acute distress because of rising employment, which got up to 10%. Now, I don't hear that. I simply don't feel it. And I think there are a couple factors left out of your analysis that you can correct. The most important probably is that the country is much richer now than it was in the early 80s, no more in the 30s. Nobody made any reference to that. You know from the Egan line research and other close studies of local companions that they have more resources than they themselves know. They're better off than they themselves know. So the surveys underrepresent the income they have. They have ways of surviving that they probably didn't have in the 30s, let alone in the 80s, let alone in the 30s. So to lose a job doesn't mean that you're destitute, the way they probably did in the 30s. That's one big fact. There's also been absolutely no mention of immigration. The fact that the country's being invaded from Mexico, and it's still being invaded from Mexico, although at a slightly lower rate. Those people are coming for jobs. They also are surviving somehow. So there's something different about the situation now. And you compare that to the government budget story we heard from, let's see, Robert Ward. There is pain and suffering. There you can sense distress and crisis, but But notice the distress and crisis is heavily due to the benefit situation, to the pensions, the Medicaid. That's not due to the recession. That's due to long-term fiscal imbalances. Nothing to do with the economy, strictly speaking. So yes, there's hardship there, but it's really not due to the recession. So I don't entirely believe what I'm hearing. I want you to respond.
I'll take a first stab, and if anyone wants to jump in. So that's a good question. I think it's an important thing to talk about. And in many ways, I don't work in direct services, so I'm not seeing the people where I would gather this story. But the numbers are incredible. When you see now 6 unemployed workers for every available job, 30% of the unemployed have been unemployed for more than half a year. So these sorts of, those numbers really do speak volumes to me. Another point that you made that I do think is important to think strongly about is, are people really richer than they were in the 80s? We know that the economy has grown strongly. Productivity has skyrocketed since that time, but the wages of the typical worker have stagnated. The living standards of regular people have not grown since the 80s. Yeah. So in the late, you're right, there's one period where that wasn't the case, it was the late 90s, when we will talk for it, but basically since 1973, the economy has grown relatively strongly in general. Wages of typical folks have stagnated. Wages of people below that have actually fallen down. So that means that these families are actually worse off. We're not set up to succeed in this. And we're coming off of the worst business cycle as far as the labor market goes in sense of great. The 2000 to 2007 business cycle saw the worst job growth. We actually saw, for the first time on record, declining family income at the median. So people really did not come into this recession with any kind of cushion that may have afforded them some wiggle room during this thing. We really are coming off one of the worst business cycles in history as far as the labor market goes, and now we're in this enormous crisis. So I hope that helps. Does anybody else have stuff they want to add?
Mark wants to talk about tax revenues.
In the short term, there's no question that the recession is driving revenues down. You know, you look at New York, look at California, the revenues are billions of dollars below what was projected 6 months to a year ago. And actual cuts are being made in enacted budgets as a result of that. In the longer term picture, and not even in the long term, even in the medium term, as the numbers I showed going back, 4 years, unquestionably you're right. The revenues today are still higher than they were, let's say in 2003, when we thought times were pretty good. So how can we possibly be having trouble now when we have more money than we did back then when times were good? The answer is that in the good years, we spend all that money plus. And for folks who are interested in income support and other programs that come under the heading of welfare, as in the name of this organization, it's important to think about where those dollars are going, because they're not going primarily to income support and related programs. They are going to Medicaid and education. Medicaid, for instance, 30 years ago was the equivalent of 8.5% of state tax revenues. Now it's about 22% of state tax revenues. So there is real displacement going on, at least in terms of where the growth in dollars goes, if not the actual dollars.
So just very quickly, I think the idea that each progressive recession, the level of living standards is a little higher than the last one. So it's true that I think people in general have a somewhat higher living standard now than maybe during the 80s recession. But I think people compare, their current situation with what they've sort of come accustomed to and what they expect and the American dream and all that. So when you look at any objective kind of measure, consumer confidence has been much lower in this recession than in any recession, even in the early 80s. So I'm not sure, it's sort of a subjective thing to say, are people really worse off now than they were in the early 80s or in the 70s? But the other thing that relates to that is, which I think I didn't really get a chance to mention. Usually I'm one of the more pessimistic people, but in this panel, it seems I'm probably one of the more optimistic people. So let me just give my 2 cents. I don't know what things are going to be like a year from now, but I think people are underestimating the degree with which the economy could come zooming back. Because this recession is more like the 70s recession and the 80s recession than it was like the last two. The severity, the fact that manufacturers have cut back inventories to very lean levels, the fact that you have this sort of big financial up and down. And so it seems plausible. I'm not saying this is not a prediction, but it certainly seems plausible that this recovery could be more like the 80s, what we call a V-shape, than these sort of mild recession, mild comebacks of the 90s and the early 2000s. And in fact, if you looked at the index of leading indicators, which is a sort of established group of leading indicators, instead of listening to the economists, you would have, that index was starting to predict in, I think, early or mid-2007, a downturn, which of course started at the end of 2007. So, and if you look at that index now, it's risen quite dramatically. So we're looking, and my graphs too, are looking at employment and sort of concurrent indicators. When you look at leading indicators, things like financial sector indicators, things like the stock market, which is actually a very good leading indicator, yield curve, and even some what we call real economy measures, there's been actually a very steep rise. If you were just looking at that instead of listening to economists and reading and kind of going out in the streets, you would think we were in for a very, not necessarily now or next month, but at some point in the not too distant future, a very sharp rebound. So I just wanted to inject, again, it's not a forecast, but I don't think, I think there's a little too much gloom that there is a chance that things could come back, the unemployment rate could definitely get up to 10% or so, but could then come back down pretty quickly.
I guess I want to balance the prospect, it appears to me, and I'm not the macro person on the panel, but the prospect of the nation was heading to a precipice that looked like the Great Depression, which some people saw as 6 months ago, is no longer, seems to be extremely likely. We don't see the types of red line on the street we saw in the Great Depression, and it certainly is true that we start this recession at a much higher level of national wealth and even well-being among the nation's better and working classes as opposed to middle classes. But none of that is to deny the fact that welfare caseloads, food stamp caseloads is the obvious one, but also in many states, state TANF caseloads have shot up sharply, reversing other patterns. Unemployment rates are clearly up, unemployment insurance claims are clearly up, health insurance coverage levels overall are down. It's likely to be sharply down when the latest poverty data comes out and those statistics. I think the idea that there is real suffering among the nation's low-income working and poor classes is undeniable. And given what I said and my predictions, I think that that's likely to continue for a considerable period of time. And then we can get into discussion about whether or not the nature of that suffering is going to be worse than it was in the last recession, with some balance between the global economic improvements and the depth of the recession. But my reading of the literature is that there really has not been that much wage and employment growth, earnings growth at the bottom of the distribution, especially once you look at individual workers, both families, and back to women and how to live towards making more money to parent families. So while the nation's economy has grown radically over the last quarter century or so, the instant bottom end is not that large. And so therefore, the deep recession now is likely to come down to levels that are similar to things that we've seen in the early recessions, perhaps even the ones in 1970. It's not a pleasant period.
I'll just, real briefly, if you look at full-time year-round male workers, their earnings have been flatlined since the early 70s. So that population, and then that population has been hit hardest in the current recession. So I think, we're going to have to watch that particular demographic group.
I'm Richard Spiegelman.
referring to Larry's comment, I think a lot of what's about to hit the fan is not yet visible. I mean, food stamps have gone up, food pantries are running out of food. The measure that we got comparing 2009 with 2003 data, last time we did this kind of study, was that whereas the number of people homeless on the street was down slightly, the percent of people doubled up or within 7 days of eviction was up 250%. So these are folks who are like right on the edge, making their budgets work by crashing with family or friends. And you can only imagine what's going to come next unless there is an economic rebound. So I think there is a lot of suffering that is not quite evident yet.
I just wanted to comment on Larry's point about sort of the Kathy Eden and Laura Lane. I did the interviews for the Boston group of that. And I think if you think about the strategies, all of those have been tightened. So they rely on family and friends, many of who have lost their jobs, so that is no longer going to be the same resource. They rely on credit, which is much harder to get, and they rely on temporary jobs, for which they now have a huge pool of people who are going to be in line for those jobs. So I think that all of the signs from what I saw of what people were doing to make ends meet, I think all of those have probably become harder. And again, it may be a matter of time. And it may be also that because this is so broad and covering so many people, that we're not paying attention in the same way we have in the past into what the pain is that bringing into the body, just because it's come up so much higher. So I think that we probably don't have the whole story. But I think that there's a lot of things going on that I think will squeeze people in much worse ways than we think.
Also, last question.
Yeah, and then I'm going to say something about when we want to start the next session. This may end up more as a comment, because this is more of a political science than we discuss it throughout the conference. But as Dick Nathan said, the institutions really matter a lot. And you know, Robert Ward is talking about the really dire state of finance. So it seems to me that it would be nice to have a political science panel that would talk about why is it that we can't ever use some of the waste that goes on, and we just keep spending the money, as Robert was saying, that we have, and it's really impossible to go back and even if we have good measures of program effectiveness, and that's what I'm proud of saying, it's what people are here mostly the thing we talk about, probably is what the most effective or more effective. We just don't get rid of the programs that are ineffective and at least try to save a little money that way, you know. And so I'm not sure I expect people on this panel to be able to answer that question. Throughout the next couple of days, I would love to hear from the political scientists about what to do about that problem. Because otherwise, it's heading over a cliff, like Robert Bridge. So that's my question. Anybody wants to answer? And then I'll talk about the next session and the time of the next session.
All right. So Jake would like to respond to your non-question.
I want to make one comment and not question to Robin's comment. And now I'll sound like an ignorant economist asking for help in political science. Maybe it's a good way to finish the panel. I think there's a lot of truth in what Robin said, which is that the current recession has touched families well up in income distribution. You know, you might have thought it was working class or lower middle class in ways that previous recessions did not. I think one of the interesting things to watch in terms of states' budgets as they get tighter and the demands increase is the extent to which we see a shift in expenditures from expenditures that have traditionally gone to the very poor parts of the economy to helping the sort of lower middle class and also be affected here. And the budgets are actually shrinking, it's not even a fixed pie, and I think the states will face an important allocation decision. And there are at least some indications that what we're going to see is that we will see moving dollars out of the very poorest families and into more middle-class families, for example, to protect expenditures on public schools as opposed to expenditures on welfare populations or Medicaid. And I
I think that's one of the emerging issues to look at as we watch where the recession plays out, its interaction with narrow social welfare policies, interaction with big budget. I don't have a crystal ball. I think there's a lot of tension.
There's no other comments. I'm going to say something about the next